Welcome to Video Game Genres, where your host Gexup provides you information you need to know about a certain number of video games put in a category. And tonight's episode of Video Game Genre is Sandbox games. You know, there was a point in time where games didn't have exploration, such as the arcade games from the 1970s and the console gaming from the early 80s. They were all linear, and their only purpose in playing them is to get the highest score. It was not till later when the public started owning computers in the 1980s, which was the rise of adventure games. Adventure games were the pioneers of exploration and adventuring in a video game. PC gaming was the only gaming system that offered exploration in their games until more role-playing games appeared. Super Mario Brothers, which made side-scrolling to combine with platforming and exploration, and another game called The Legend of Zelda that fundamentally made an action game where you can go anywhere and do pretty much anything, aka action-adventure games. Exploration is the major factor of adventuring in the gameplay. Video games since then has turned such gameplay into an adventurous experience, allowing the player to have their own adventure, thus abandoned the arcade-like gameplay, which only purpose was to make players to break record points. Since then, exploration has created new video game genres, which we all take for granted today. The better our technology gets, the less linear and more possibilities our games has become. But one video game genre that can't virtually be bigger than this video game genre is sandbox games. Even though sandbox games isn't the first non-linear video game genre, but it is the one genre that creates a whole new world with so many things to interact with and so many missions offered that can be started whenever the player decides to. This game genre was established when Grand Theft Auto 3 was released, selling millions of copies around the world, and other games followed such formula. Before we talk about the genre, we must go through the history of this popular video game genre going beyond the first Grand Theft Auto on the PlayStation 1. Taking a look back at one of the earliest non-linear gameplay is to see the gaming platform that originated adventuring in video games, the personal computer. Now, these were the days where we had such PCs such as the DOS, Amiga, the Commodore 64, and more. And the games that were offered in those platforms were already starting to have their own exploration. But the one PC game that made exploration in 3D is a classic called Elite, released in 1984. This is the very game that originated 3D graphics by introducing wireframe graphics. Without it, then we wouldn't be where we are today. While Elite has been regarded as one of the best flight simulator games, it also created non-linear gameplay with players to explore other planets and blast off enemy ships who tried to take you out. Elite is credited as being the breakthrough title that defined the modern space flight simulator genre, and also being credited for being the first truly open-ended game. This game was truly profound because it presented a game world space and the freedom of movement and choices that the first time felt real. The game world no longer appeared to be a closed labyrinth or a hilly continuum, but is now an open universe. Then in 1985, a revolutionary PC game that extended the open-ended gameplay was Mercenary. It was an action-adventure game in a first-person perspective that the player must explore a world rendered in real-time 3D graphics and also completing a number of tasks in order to achieve a single main objective. Mercenary derives from the player's role in carrying out tasks as a hired gun. The game was set in cities with buildings and other objects to create such environments, was presented using wireframe graphics. In Mercenary, the player crash lands into an ongoing conflict and is able to play the warring faction off against one another to the player's own advantage, plus exploring freely. To my knowledge, this has to be the very first sandbox game because you have exploration, missions to select and start, and even have action involved. And it had gotten better over the years with the sequels of Mercenary such as Democles, also known as Mercenary 2, and Mercenary 3, where they evolved the wireframe graphics and improved it with solid vector graphics, allowing both a more realistic and colorful world, more people in open-ended world to interact with, and made both of those games much more open-ended. Then in 1986, another PC game called Turbo Express provided a 3D free-roaming city environment and has been cited as a major influence in driving games and sandbox games in general because it featured driving into any direction you want to go, and there are many cars in your direction that obey traffic laws. It is this very game that made such innovations that we all use today whenever we drive in video games. You know, the Mercenary trilogy allowed you to kill your targets, but not everybody you see. But the one game that has gotten better than Mercenary was a game from 1990 called The Terminator for DOS. Now, we Terminator fans know that there has been so many Terminator games that utterly disappoints us, but this one is not only an exception, but as well innovative. Terminator for the DOS was a free-roam, open-world game that sets its action in modern-day city that extends for miles and included the ability to buy and steal weapons and items from shops, hijack vehicles, and the ability to fire at civilians. This game was written in 100% assembly, and it takes up more than 35,000 lines of both wireframe and vector, contains approximately 20,000 3D objects, and there were more than 300 frames of animation created. This game was a beast back in 1990, but regardless, these were the elements that Sandbox games follow. Then in 1991, a PC game called Hunter was released, and this is what sets the ground rules of Sandbox games today. Now, there have been so many open world games that were in first person, but this was the first open-ended game that was in third person, and playing the game in a third person perspective, you can see much more of your surroundings and do much more actions. The game consisted a large open world where there are numerous possibilities to complete different missions. The character could travel on foot or ride on different vehicles such as cars, tanks, bicycles, boats, helicopters, hovercrafts, and more. Moreover, Hunter also has unique features such as day and night lighting, fuel modeling, a logbook, aerial observation units, tank traps, landmines, and computer-controlled rocket batteries, and tracer guns. It was also possible to ride a bicycle, swim underwater, windsurf, or even parachute up from a helicopter. But most of all the missions offered in this game wasn't just reaching your destination and kill someone, it also included various other missions such as destroying buildings, find and collect items, and more. This is a game that made 3D gaming much more interactive and detailed, but regardless of how groundbreaking Hunter was, developers at the time didn't follow or improve upon this style of gameplay for 6 years. For the reasons why they didn't take over what Hunter left off, I don't really know. During this time, 3D gaming capitalized the gaming world with such revolutionary titles such as Super Mario 64, creating a 3D non-linear world with platforming, or 3D platformers for short. But the next upcoming soon-to-be-called Sandbox game wasn't 3D, but instead 2D in a bird's eye view. In 1997, a company called DMA Design, also known today as Rockstar Games, has released Grand Theft Auto. This was not based on the 1977 movie with the same name, but it was a brand new series which followed the formula from Hunter, where you can hijack vehicles at any time and use them to fast travel in a huge world that you can use to cause death and destruction throughout the city. The object of the game is to complete missions set for completion, such as bank robberies, assassinations, and other crimes. The game made a sequel in 1999 with Grand Theft Auto 2, which didn't change the gameplay, but made it twice as violent and twice as fun as the original. New to the series are pedestrians and civilians interacting in this world, brand new side missions, and much more variety of how to destroy things. But before Grand Theft Auto 2 and after Grand Theft Auto 1, DMA Design has created this soon-to-be-called Sandbox game for the Nintendo 64, and that is Body Harvest. This game didn't go in the same direction of causing crime and destruction like in Grand Theft Auto, but instead you play as this genetically engineered soldier who must investigate and eliminate alien attack forces that has returned once every 25 years to harvest the human population for their organic material. The game included 60 different vehicles to ride on, mission objectives and side missions that randomly pop up across the map that visually covers up 1,000 virtual square miles, and you have camera control to look at anything within your range. Body Harvest requires the players to stop aliens from slaughtering everyone in the shield area. The player will navigate the map, often coming across towns where aliens will teleport to attack the town and harvest civilians. Aliens will also warp frequently to attack the player and can appear from the land, air, or sea. Generally, gameplay consists of completing a series of missions, and these are very basic, such as reaching a certain area, but other missions can also be more complicated and require a careful thought and skill. Once the player completes a mission, they are prompted to check the map to find what's the next mission is. But don't expect this game to be a Grand Theft Auto game where you can kill anyone in sight, because there's a meter at the bottom of the screen that represents civilian casualties. If too many civilians die, including friendly fire, the aliens will destroy the area and then you failed the mission. It showed that this gameplay that was started from Hunter and the rest of the games that I've already mentioned could have success, and it's credited for making DMA Design's next upcoming game possible. But before we name the next game, there are two more games that has elements that Sandbox games today borrows heavily. One of them system is Driver for the PlayStation 1, released in 1999. Driver was an open-world driving game that allowed players to go anywhere on the map. You can receive damage from the car that you ride on, and there is another meter that measures all the driving laws that you broke, and the higher the meter goes, the more and more police will come after you. But what's important about Driver is that it featured a mini-map at the bottom of the screen that indicates where in the map are you in, making it incredibly easy for the player to know where to turn, and fixes the issue of continuously pressing the pause button to see the map. Maps are important in open-world games because it's easy to get lost when you have so many directions to go, but it's important to locate your mission objectives and special attractions. This map system is also borrowed heavily from future games like Midnight Club Street Racing, Shenmue, Driver 2, Crazy Taxi, and more. Then on the Dreamcast, we had the commercially unsuccessful Shenmue, released in 1999 in Japan and 2000 in North America and Europe. Shenmue was a major step forward for 3D open world gameplay and considered the originator of the open city subgenre, but it's much more considered as an adventure game with action rather than a sandbox game. Shenmue was sent out to reinvent the dying adventure game genre by offering an unparalleled level of player freedom, giving them a full reign to explore an expansive open city with its own day-to-night cycles, changing the weather, and fully voiced non-playable characters going on their daily routines. The game's large interactive environments, level of detail, and scope of its urban sandbox exploration has been compared to later sandbox games, but unfortunately, like other adventure games at the time, it has commercially failed, leaving Sega unfinished after Shenmue 2 was released in Japan and Europe. Then in 2001, DMA Design has changed their names to Rockstar Games and made a game that set the standards of the so-called sandbox game genre is the ever-so-revolutionary Grand Theft Auto 3 for the PlayStation 2. Grand Theft Auto 3 took the gameplay foundation of the first two Grand Theft Auto games and expanded it to a 3D world. Unlike the previous Grand Theft Auto games, this one is story-based and a mature one on that because it deals with crimes and gangs all around Liberty City, plus the writing of the story felt like it belonged in a crime movie. But most importantly, Grand Theft Auto 3 created a genre that has evolved with greater levels of environmental details, more realistic behaviors such as damage on the car, and destructible objects and environments, and such behaviors to pedestrians, all of which just adds realism of video games like never before. This very game was a much greater success than its direct precursors, and its influence was profound. So profound in fact that so many developers followed the formula and created so many new ideas, thus expanding such gameplay genre, calling it Grand Theft Auto clones. Grand Theft Auto clones? I thought these were sandbox games. Yes, unfortunately, there are still people out there that don't want to regard these games as sandbox games and just simple-mindedly call them Grand Theft Auto clones because of the similarities. Critics and fans of the genre consider such term unfair because there are many like it that doesn't just drive and shoot. I, for one, agree that it is unfair because I don't want a genre that only emphasizes just one series. I mean, look at all the other games before Grand Theft Auto that created the non-linear gameplay to this now called sandbox game. I mean, look at Doom, for example. For the longest time, any game that followed the formula of this new game genre for the longest time throughout the 90s only called them Doom clones, and it was not up till Quake, Turok, and GoldenEye 007 to get people off their minds from calling them Doom clones and gave them an official genre name calling them first-person shooters. So why can't we do the same with sandbox games? Some regard sandbox or non-linear gameplay isn't a genre, but an element and design. Well, platforming is an element, and platforms are designs, and a game that has jumping through these platforms throughout is a platformer. Fighting is an element, and a game that has fighting throughout is a fighting game. And action games that has action throughout is, well, you get the picture. The point I'm making here is that genres are all categories of games that are imitating each other, just creating new ways and ideas to continuously expand the variety of games that have similar gameplay. It's hard to make something totally innovative and create a genre that has no similarities with any other. Not only in video games, but also movies, books, and television shows. I mean, can somebody out there make something that isn't horror, action, romance, thriller, comedy, documentary, epic, disaster, superhero, crime, mystery, art, sci-fi, fantasy, or animated? Since fans of these so-called GTA clones call them sandbox games, we give them the name. With that out of the way, let's continue talking about sandbox games. But before we get there, we have to answer this question. Why do we call this action-adventure subgenre sandbox games? Well, if you look at the actual children's sandbox, they are filled with toys and other playable things that is safe for the child, big enough to fill the box. Since there are a lot of room to put in so many toys, a child has to crawl to one one side of the sandbox to the other to reach the toy he or she wants to play, similar to how we want to reach our destinations in these games. Plus, the maps in these sandbox games are in a square shape, so I guess that's where we got the name from. But also like a sandbox is that we never know what is coming in the sandbox game, like we're all going to bump into an enemy or an authority, or are we going to find something cool. Whatever the case, it's always exciting to see the unexpected, just like how a child finds a toy underneath the sand. The reason why I'm comparing sandbox game to an actual child who plays in the sandbox is because the metaphor of a child playing in the sandbox represents free roaming. Well, if you're not including Minecraft, there's one thing that we can't do in a sandbox game that a child can actually do in an actual sandbox: create and build stuff with sand. That seems to be like more the programmer and designer's duty to do that, and we're the ones who play what they created, so can you see the irony here? But at the same time, we gave the name Sandbox because never was there a video game genre that lets the player to give so much freedom to explore and do whatever they want, just as long as the developers vary such interactions. And you know what? It's hard to imagine another video game genre that could virtually be bigger than the biggest virtual square miles of sandbox game today, because it's already huge and it will keep getting bigger the more sandbox games we'll get. But let's set the ground rules of what categorized as a sandbox game, because there are a lot of confusion of the differences between a game that is simply non-linear in design and a traditional sandbox game. And you know how many rules to categorize a sandbox game? Only 2. For a video game genre that is very popular today, you only need 2 things to categorize as a sandbox game, and each of them have a lot of things to discuss about. The first and most important thing to even categorize a game as a sandbox is to have, of course, an open world and almost everything to be interactive. This is unlike any other non-linear design games out there because it varies almost everything that fits what the designers want to put in their game. The reason why I like non-linear games is because the more space you have, the more room you have with variety, with almost everything to be available and to be used whenever you have the chance to use it. Take it like this: linear games cannot fit a tank in a small narrow path, and there's no other direction other than following the path that the designers made. Non-linear games, however, more than has enough room to fit almost anything, and how Sandbox game handles such non-linearity is massive and nearly impeccable. The way Sandbox games since the release of Grand Theft Auto 3 handle such a game is to make their games not only a brand new world, but to make them lively. They made their physics in their world very interesting, such as cars crashing into objects that you run into, objects caught on fire from combustible gas and objects, and more. There are just so many things about these games that create a sense of realism in its own world. Speaking of realism, also there are not only enemies in these games that may or may not try to kill you, but also there are innocent bystanders that are just as interactive as each of these game worlds themselves. Having civilians in an open world game started with the Terminator for DOS. These civilians are those everyday people who walks and drives in the streets, or if it's not a city-based game, they act as innocents going on their daily lives, and they have human psychology to react to whatever action you're doing, such as if you leave them alone, they'll just mind their own business. If you attack them, the individual you just heard either runs away or they want to fight you. If you shoot a weapon or cause a massive attack, then the crowd starts running away from you. These are all mechanics of a video game character's AI to have human psychology done well in a video game that was inspired by The Sims. These are not only traditional characters that waits for you to talk to them, like in role-playing games, and they don't walk up to you and try to kill you. These are all just real as to seeing people in the real world. However, there are exceptions to that rule of being able to kill anyone you encounter, such as Spider-Man 2, Body Harvest, and Batman Arkham City, that's trying to stay in character as a superhero, and your duty is to protect innocent people, and Assassin's Creed series, where Ezio and the Altair never killed civilians, but if you killed a couple of them, the game restarts. And some sandbox games like Sly 2 and 3 doesn't have civilians, but only enemies. With such ability to interact with these characters, the fun part about sandbox games is that you can terrorize the world freely if you want to. But the irony about the metaphor of the term sandbox as a child playing in the sandbox without a care in the world is kind of misleading, because you also have a lot of consequences when you committed such felony in the virtual world. Just when you thought that these games let you do whatever wherever you want, whenever you want, along comes your enemies, the police, or other authorities protecting the open world from your doing. Well, not all sandbox games have authorities to go against you when you do criminal actions, but when you encounter one of them, then you made yourself a target, and they'll try to either arrest you, but most likely they want to kill you. Some sandbox games that has this feature have a bar to indicate how serious this offense is. The bar will get higher the more violations you make, and the higher it goes, the more of these enemies will come after you, and the more powerful the force will become. You can stand and fight if you want, but chances of you surviving against these oncoming attacks becomes very slim because they'll keep coming after you until you die. But there are ways to get away such massive numbers of enemies, such as finding a way to lose out of sight and keep out of sight for a while till the meter goes away, or if the authorities are too powerful that hiding is impossible. Such games such as Grand Theft Auto has stray garages that repaints your vehicle to make these police not notice you to get them off your back. Even though you may or may not like the feature of having the authorities, but at least this is the best way to balance out the game from making you to become too powerful. But back on the open world, because such titles that are this massive encourages players to explore the virtual world. With all honesty, exploring all of them on foot will be incredibly dull, so to speed things up, many sandbox games offer a great variety of vehicles from cars, tanks, bikes, planes, helicopters, hover bikes, hover cars, horses, animals to ride on, and all other kinds of vehicles you can drive. And to add much more variety, you also have different kinds of them like vans, Hondas, ice cream trucks, and etc. And without them, otherwise the games wouldn't be as lively as it should be. Sometimes you can fast travel on trains and taxis, but the boring part about this uncontrollable rides is that it defeats the purpose of exploration. But not all sandbox games have vehicles, because some developers figure out how to make traveling on foot to be more exciting than your traditional sandbox games like the Assassin's Creed and Slice series, where they made traveling on rooftops fun, and other sandbox games that give your character superpowers like Cole from Infamous riding on telephone poles, riding on wires, and other electrical things, Spider-Man swinging across the city, and more. The best sandbox games always makes your travels interesting, and to do that there has to be enemies that you'll encounter that will automatically attack you when they see you, assume civilians that randomly commits a crime, a person that needs you to save them, a side quest that pops out of nowhere, a store to buy items and weapons, an idiot in your way, random situations you encounter, items to collect, and hidden object to find, and whatever the designers have put in the game to keep the world that they created interesting. And since you'll be traveling a lot, a map is needed to indicate where in this virtual world you're at, and it's a pain in the ass to keep pressing the start button to look up at the map. So we have a mini map at the edge of the screen to act as a compass that rotates when you rotate the camera or make the character to turn, and there are icons on the map to tell you if there's a mission, location of the mission objective, or any case of a special interest like shops, jobs, and etc. Traditionally, sandbox games are this big wide open area that ranges from the size of a city to an actual country, and in the entire game you'll remain in that map. It should be at least big enough to change environments from cities, deserts, and anything else that the designers choose. But not everything is non-linear, because you also have linear areas when you go inside buildings and other indoor areas. I'm tempted to say that all sandbox games are only one map, but there are game series like the Assassin's Creed, Sly, and Destroy All Humans that doesn't stick with just only one map, but multiple maps that changes at each part of the story you're in. But just because I said that doesn't mean that any game that has levels that are massive automatically means that it's a sandbox game, because despite how some games are non-linear, if it's point A to B and only a few missions offered in that map, then it shouldn't be considered a sandbox game, because it's not a world, it's a level. And if there's one thing to do in a particular map, then it's also not a sandbox game. Which brings me to the second major thing to even categorize a non-linear game as a sandbox game, and that is missions. Here's another irony of the metaphor of the term sandbox as a child playing in the sand without a care in the world, because when you start a sandbox game, the game doesn't let you explore the entire world just yet, because the player's freedom to explore may be limited until they completed a certain mission objective and advance to the game's plot. There's at least a direction to a certain part of the map that's a blocked road, a barrier, or something else that restricts you from reaching to any other area of the map. But if you somehow get past through the restricted area, then the authorities may come after you. But whatever the case, the object of the game is to complete these missions. These missions don't just come out at random when you finished one, it's up to you to decide whenever to do it, which in itself allows the player to free roam until the player is bored and wants to do something interesting in the game. And that's where missions come in to increase the fun factor. You can always find a mission in the map and also your mini-map. They have those icons that indicate the location where the mission is and who in the storyline is giving you this mission. Each character in the storyline has his or her own icon or symbol, and very often they're at their homes, territories, and at special occasion, they await for you in other areas on the map to fit the story. Ever since Grand Theft Auto 3 was released, Sandbox games nowadays add a plot. Whenever you start a mission, a cutscene will appear showing the situation the character is in and shows the other character to tell your main character to do a certain mission, which may or may not improve the character development. I'm usually for gameplay and storyline secondary when it comes to video games, but adding a story in a video game is important so we can understand why we're going through a mission, and watching a cutscene whenever you begin a mission makes the player to understand what's going on and why he or she is doing all this stuff. And what I like about missions in these Sandbox games is that they give you all sorts of challenges. Believe me when I say this, there are so many mission varieties to keep the fun factor running rather than just free roaming. Many involve racing, escorting characters, killing certain targets, stealing cars or an item, running away from the authorities, beat the clock, and so many more that I just can't name them all. Fortunately, your reward in completing a mission is either get money, unlock more parts of the map, or unlock new features like weapons, jobs, and the rest. And sometimes you end up with a new character that will give you his or her own mission afterwards. Very often in Sandbox game, you have multiple characters just waiting for you to show up in their place and begin their mission. You can decide which of the characters' mission you want to do, but each of the characters have so many missions that it could take forever to complete them all, and it's always a big annoyance to have two different characters just waiting for you to begin their mission when they're distances away from each other. That makes traveling to their own location tedious. Not to mention that some of the bad missions you can't skip, and you need to beat it to progress. Sometimes when a character has an important mission, he or she won't let you start their mission without completing all the other characters' mission, which means that you're probably going to be in the next chapter or you're going to have more parts of the map unlocked. Completing a core mission will unlock further missions and advance the story, but if a player fails a mission, they'll be able to resume the game from before the mission began. In addition, these games usually offer optional side missions, which allows players to gain other rewards. These side missions improve the game's replay value and are also known for incorporating numerous mini-games into the game world. Ultimately, this allows the player to follow or ignore the game's storyline as they see fit. The production of a Sandbox game is a subtractive operation. Subtract the missions, the main objective, the narrative, or whatever formally binds the game's progression, and you have a full sandbox. The player can fool around without doing anything on task, or so, with limited space without a completion of a mission. I think it's a great structure of gameplay to have missions and narratives first before free roaming, because if you're just giving free roaming automatically, then the game is automatically boring. It's like saying Metroid, if you have all the powers at the beginning of the game, then that's it, no challenge. And those are the two things to even categorize a non-linear game as a Sandbox game. Because really any game in a certain genre can be non-linear, but it's the specific gameplay that categorizes it as this genre. And you know what? Just like 3D platformers, Sandbox game is a great game genre that works really well with mixing other game genres. Grand Theft Auto and all the other gangster Sandbox games technically is a sandbox that mixes a third-person shooter and driving. Jak 2 and 3 are Sandbox games that mixes with 3D platformer. The Sly Cooper series proved that stealth gaming can work well with not only a 3D platformer, but also in a sandbox. LA Noire is a sandbox that focuses a lot of elements from adventure games. Midnight Club and the Need for Speed series are sandbox driving games. The Elder Scrolls and Fallout 3 are RPG sandbox games, and so many other games out there that mixes sandbox gameplay with other genres very well. Very often these titles are just either action or a third-person shooter, but at a special occasion they could be something else. The big reason why I love Sandbox games is that never was there a game that puts in almost everything I can imagine that was in real life to be in a video game. Out of all the varieties in a video game, Sandbox probably offered the most. I never imagined that you could put all sorts of vehicles into a singular game, from bicycles to a Ferrari, a propellered airplane to a stealth bomber, from monster trucks to tanks. Causing carnage and numerous ways of killing anyone in a video game makes it all the more fun. That in itself caused a lot of controversy to the the public and to the politics against video games, but just the feeling to be like the chaotic bad guy for once was sheer fun. But most of all, it's the missions of many of these great titles and making it story driven that made each of these games in this genre so interesting. It's the one thing that provides challenge to the player and keeps away the feel of repetitiveness. Even though I do have a lot of problems with this genre of being so big that traveling to your destination is tedious, there are a lot of interesting parts on the map that won't let you do anything with it unless you do a mission that takes place in that location, and perhaps a lot of bad missions that I can't skip. But at least this is the genre today that is a big alternative from the oversaturation of first-person shooters, because really, this genre is a huge realistic world, and there are so many new ideas that Sandbox games will soon achieve. If you like Sandbox games, you already know how awesome they are, but if you only like linear games, I can't really recommend this for you. But I'm glad I did an episode of video game genres on Sandbox games because, with all honesty, it's one of my favorites.